Hey everybody, Eric from Dead Tech here, and I want to offer an apology because it has been a long time since I've created new content for the Dead Tech blog or this channel. We were on vacation for a week, and then I had a consulting project in addition to running Hit Subscribe, so kind of a week of fun followed by 2 weeks of intense work, and the thing that fell by the wayside was content creation. C'est la vie, but I am back, and I figured I'd ease my way back in by doing a sequence of reader questions again in one of these videos. And I will say I'm looking at the clock now and I'm doing kind of an experiment. I have a call in 22 minutes, so I'm going to try to do this in one single take and flawlessly. And yeah, let's see how that goes, because normally it's just like throwing things into production, right? You just do that and everything's fine. So let's do it. Okay, diving into the reader questions. The first one is about YAGNI and TDD. And let me see here. When trying to do TDD by the book with some junior developers several years ago, something we wrestled with was tests being the boat anchor as the architecture evolved. Some context, we were working our way through a code kata where we tried to emulate a typical dev cycle where we don't peek at all at requirements in the kata because requirements change. Fair enough. We ended up doing the red-green refactor cycle, only building up as much code API as was needed for the requirements we had, no gold plating allowed. Then as we read the next requirement, our API needed to change because YAGNI was broken. We need it now. That caused many of our tests to change because the requirements evolved. Our tests needed to keep up. Had we peeked ahead, we would have done some testable design. Have you seen this issue resolved in your travels? This is a complicated question, and it's sort of a classic problem. I've been part of a lot of agile transformations, if you will, where you're kind of introducing the ideas of extreme programming, implementing Scrum, doing this type of stuff. And you go from this world where you have these huge design documents or whatever, kind of in an RUP or waterfall world, to implementing this freeing kind of policy of emergent design. And YAGNI is one of the bellwether principles of that. And YAGNI, for those of you who may not know, stands for you ain't gonna need it. So don't go gold plating your code, don't go build in a logging layer or whatever until you know you actually need that. This is a nice reaction and a nice counterpoint to an approach previously where you would kind of speculatively build all this stuff and then incur the maintenance of that stuff, and you may not even need it. Now, there's an irony here, which is that the person asking this question is talking about their approach actually creating this kind of legacy cruft in the form of tests when they might have peeked ahead and seen how to do it a little bit better. So with that in mind, I guess I'll say that this is a classic problem that you can boil down to dogma versus pragmatism in a sense. And I don't mean to kind of cast aspersions on this idea of being dogmatic, but when you go away from this world of careful, big upfront design, a lot of the time you're going to need to break muscle memory. So it's kind of like going on a sugar cleanse or something if you've, been eating too much sugar. So instead of kind of adopting a middle road, you go really extreme in the opposite direction and you say, I am going to write no line of code until the absolute last minute when we get the requirement in. We're just going to seek to keep the code base as, flexible as possible and to only plan in the immediate future. And I'll say that's a valuable thing to do as an exercise in breaking the habit of over-planning, because I would say that over-planning is kind of worse than under-planning in my travels from what I've seen. And you can't really go to the middle of the road very easily. You kind of have to go through these katas, these exercises, and then break that cycle before you can kind of come back to the middle of the road. So what I would say is this approach works well for code katas, probably not for your code base as much. You do need to do some thinking through of what your application is going to be. I mean, maybe you could get away without doing that, but it's not super practical. So I think what really happens is if you adopt this practice and you kind of commit it to muscle memory, where you're going to skeptically look at future and speculative requirements and just kind of work against what you know in the short term while keeping your options open, that's a good path to walk. So kind of what happens here is as you practice that, YAGNI is you ain't gonna need it, and you're focusing on the ag, where you develop the wisdom to know what you will and will not need. Because, you know, it's one thing to say, well, we don't know that we need this logging layer because the card hasn't come across in our Scrum backlog yet. But if you do know that it's a requirement of the project, I don't know that I would artificially constrain yourself by saying, well, we're going to pretend because we haven't seen this card yet that it's not going to be necessary. So that's my take on reader question 1. Let me move on to reader question 2. How to get expert beginners learning again. So for those of you not familiar, I'll put a link in the show notes here. The Expert Beginner is the series I wrote about people who kind of are locally maximized, the king of a small kingdom. Often in smaller dev shops, you've got somebody who's actually sort of incompetent, but they were there from the beginning and management trusts them. And this person, when you bring in new hires, has these quirky oddball ways of doing things that tend to chase developers off. That's the Expert Beginner. So this reader question is saying, I read your blog on expert beginners and found it extremely interesting. I was wondering if you could suggest ways to get the expert beginners to start learning again. There is more to the question here, but I think that sort of summarizes it. It's just kind of fleshing out that concept. So you have this expert beginner, maybe the architect of a small software team that thinks he is a lot more knowledgeable than he is and is imposing all these weird policies. And how do you get that person away from assuming that they're always right because they have the most experience at the company, and to start opening themselves up to the idea that maybe they don't actually know quite as much as they think, and I guess learning and sort of flipping over from what they think of as teaching mode to learning mode. And that's pretty tough. So in thinking about this, you need to sort of break their mental model of themselves, and that's not an easy thing to do. You need to convince them that they aren't actually experts, and that in fact they have a lot of learning to do. And so if you're the type of person that is, given to concluding that you don't really have much more to learn, and that point of view is reinforced by the people around you, especially the people above you in the organization, that is a tough row to hoe. If you are managing a person like this and you want to get them learning again, the easiest way to do that is to break them out of this cocoon of comfort that they're in, move them to a different team, have them occupy a different role, put them in a situation where they can't just say, I've been doing this for 20 years, so you have to listen to me because I've been here the longest. Literally take them out of that situation, and that will probably, reignite the learning spark. If you are a subordinate or a peer, I honestly wouldn't bother trying, because the only way you could maybe really do that is with sort of a show of force, to come to them and just over and over again sort of prove them wrong. But this person will perceive that as an attack and probably use their leverage and standing in the organization to make your life difficult. And I will say that the roles of unemployment are probably littered with the dead of this approach. I wouldn't recommend that. So if you find yourself in a situation presided over by expert beginners, I kind of hate to say this to be a quitter or whatever, but I would probably, dust off your resume and think about moving on personally. I wouldn't try to kind of, if you're not managing them, convince these people to be better citizens of the company and the tech industry. It's not that you can't do it, but it's going to be a really long, frustrating, and probably perilous battle for you. Okay, so question 3 here. Let me take a look. Books and resources for thinking like a programmer. So I'm not going to read all of this. Somebody wrote in, and thank you for writing. Basically talking about being a newbie to the programming world, wanting to transition into it, sort of fresh out of college, but not with a programming background. So he's asking, what are some books and or resources to think like a programmer? So I'll throw a couple out there and, put links to these in the show notes. Some of my favorite have been The Pragmatic Programmer by Andy Hunt and, I forget the other gentleman's name, I apologize. Clean Code by Uncle Bob Martin. I think of these as books that help you get into the mindset of being a professional programmer. Quick apology, there is actually this helicopter. I'm recording this from the Florida Keys, and we are getting buzzed by this helicopter all morning. It's like circling our house. I feel like they're, like chasing drug refugees or something. Anyway, that's why you might be hearing that noise. So anyway, these two books, The Pragmatic Programmer and Clean Code, are really more kind of, once you have programming skills, how do you conduct yourself as a professional programmer? How do you improve and get better and continuously improve? Maybe in relation to the last question, how do you not become an expert beginner? In terms of actually learning to think like a programmer, I am going to say that the best resource for that is not going to be a book. It's going to be practice. And here's why. I don't mean to cop out, but when it comes to being a programmer, what you're doing is dealing with a compiler or an interpreter, and that is almost like dealing with the most extreme kind of savant that you can imagine. A compiler is going to take the source code that you write, and it's going to turn it into a set of instructions that the computer understands and executes. And this is a powerful thing. It's got lots of, digital memory and space and processing power at its disposal, but it's also incredibly stupid. And that means that you have to be incredibly literal in your instructions to it. This is a complete counterpoint to natural language that you and I use to interact, where if I say something and I flub it just a little bit, you're going to understand what I mean. People who don't really speak the same language can even manage to communicate. You cannot get a single syllable or letter wrong when you're talking to the compiler. So what you have to learn to do is pay a lot of attention to very specific details, be very precise and logical and structured in your thinking. And I don't think you're going to read a book that's going to tell you how to do that. You are going to have to practice doing it, and that's going to be some hard-won, hard-fought experience. It'll be at times frustrating and at times rewarding. So you really kind of do that by writing computer programs. So I think really that's kind of be your focus. I would look for books and resources that are introducing you to programming in a way that lets you practice. So you don't want to read like 500 pages about the syntax of C++ or something. Get a book that kind of teaches you enough theory about what you're doing to get going, but then walks you through exercises. And that's really going to be, I think, the best way to start thinking like a programmer. All right, question 4. Let's see here. This one, okay, what has changed to make the Efficiencer path easier to follow? And this is asking a direct question from my book, Developer Hegemony, where I talk about this idea of an Efficiencer who actually, as the question asker describes it, that might be the best backstory instead of diving into my book. He says, first the question, the Efficiencer model looks a lot like management consulting, except that the consultants here can do the automation as well. And what has changed to make this path more suitable for software developers to follow? So with the Efficiencer book, I talk about programmers not as coders, but basically about they're professionals who deliver business value around automation. So the programmer is somebody who solves problems with automation rather than somebody who responds to a job ad saying we need 6 years of C++ or whatever. So they're going to have an area of expertise and they're going to be working with you as a partner. It kind of collapses the idea that you traditionally have of software development, which is you've got the software developers and then you've got the business people that manage those software developers. Really, at its core, it collapses this into one person, and it says that there's no reason a single human cannot do both of these things. That's kind of the idea of an Efficiencer. And so the reader is asking, what is making this an easier thing to do now as opposed to in years past? So I think the thing that's maybe making it easier, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, is you've got more developers kind of getting their entrepreneurial wings. And what I mean by that is you've got more developers that are becoming entrepreneurs. And I don't mean the Silicon Valley missionary style of entrepreneur. I'm going to go make a dent in the universe. I'm going to get venture capital, so I am the CEO, but I'm also kind of an employee. I don't mean that. I mean entrepreneurs, developers that are going off on their own to do side hustles and then bootstrapping and building their own businesses, because by definition, those people are learning to solve business problems and they're having to do it in a way that's profitable from day one. So there are more and more of these people. I'm actually now plugged into a number of communities that are like this. So I see them. They are out there, even if you don't see them. The numbers aren't huge, but they're growing, and this is a movement. But really, that's kind of the only thing that's made this easier to follow. because it's still not easy to do this. And the reason it's not easy to do this is because the broader programming world is still trapped in this mindset that you've got programmers who have one set of skills, business people who have another, and the business people have to manage the programmers because everybody knows that programmers can't do business. And we reinforce this. We, as an entire software industry, programmers included, because if you're out there and you go and you do the stupid kind of interviews that, like, you know, whiteboards and Google gives to you and all that, you participate in that, you're perpetuating this. If you go to sites like codefights or whatever.com and practice, you know, programming trivia and Arcania, again, you are focusing on elevating your craft to the point of diminishing returns rather than starting to think like a business person. So we are our own biggest barrier to this, and it's not an easy path to follow because you kind of have to have this Matrix-like moment where you realize that that's kind of stupid. And then you have to blaze your own trail, to go off on your own, to start understanding business, and to refuse to be managed by people because of this sort of stereotype that if you have technical skills, you need somebody to herd you like a, you know, pack animal of some sort that only has this one weird specific skill. So I guess the short form of that is very little has made the Efficiencer career path easy to follow. It's a lucrative and rewarding one precisely because it isn't easy. But, you know, I'm hoping, especially based on the communities I'm participating in, that we will see more and more of this over the course of time. So that's it. I have to this point done this in one take. You might see a few jump cuts when I'm all said and done. Might have seen the jump cuts. I don't know, maybe we'll just do this unedited. Anyway, if you like these videos, feel free to subscribe to the channel. I am going to keep doing more of them. And if you liked it, I would love it if you gave me a like. That actually helps the channel. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. However you want to engage, that is up to you. And I will catch you next time. Thanks as always for watching.